Chased, submitted by Giddy Kitty. A long time ago, when most people hearing this were probably not even born, I was driving from Chicago to visit my friend at Southern Illinois University. It was a straight shot for the most part, but my friend I was visiting, I'll call her Christy, asked me to stop at her grandmother's house off the beaten path in the middle of nowhere, in a place called Iola. She wanted some papers from her family that were going to be part of some project she was working on at school. Hey, no big deal to me. I'd get off Route 57 and fly over there and then get back on the interstate. I left early in the afternoon so I could get to Carbondale in time for dinner and then be able to go out dancing. Following my written down instructions, no cell phones or GPS, kids, we just had maps and such, I got to an exit that would take me to Iola and Christy's grandparents' house. I found that easy too, and her sweet grandmother made me stay and chat for a bit and have something to eat. I really wanted to get back on the road, but how do you say no to a little old lady who lives way out in the country? Like so many stories on this channel, here my troubles began. Her grandfather, a well-intentioned soul, gave me different directions to head south and get on Route 57 at a different exit. Apparently there was construction on the way I was going, and this back route would be faster. Being a 20-year-old idiot, I agreed, thinking of the prospects of my friend and hot guys at the college. The sun was going down as I started driving down country roads, and I was just playing my tapes on the car stereo, hoping this would get me to Christie's faster. Not long after I left, I saw I needed gas, so I stopped in another little nowhere town called Xenia. Basically, there was a gas station there and not much else. I filled up on gas and tried the payphone to call Christy to let her know where I was and I was going to be probably late, but it was out of order. I noticed out of the corner of my eye a guy in a pickup truck talking to another guy in a car. They were really giving me the once-over. Armed with some chips and Pepsi, I got back on my little horizon and looked at the directions again. I was to stay south until I got to another interstate, get on that, and then head west to 57. No problem. I jogged through Xenia town proper, and this place looked like a freaky movie out of the 70s with this strip of building storefronts and nothing else. And soon I was back out in the boonies. It was dark when the lights went on behind me, and I saw what looked like a cop, but now I realized it wasn't cop lights at all. But I wasn't too sure, so I pulled over and the guy in the car got out and came over to my window. It was the guy from the gas station, and he had this blue shirt on with some emblems, but it didn't look like a real uniform. But again, I'm out in the middle of nowhere and don't know what I'm dealing with. He asked for my license and all that stuff, and asked me if I knew why I was being pulled over. Not really knowing, I said as much, and he walked back to his car. I was pissed that I was being waylaid and knowing that I hadn't done anything wrong. He came back and asked me to step out of the car, and being young and dumb and not knowing I didn't have to do this, I got out. The guy said something about me having a nice body and handed my stuff back, but as I reached for it, he pulled it away playfully, at least that was playfully in his head, and he asked if I was interested in going on a date that night. I was taken aback, but I was also smart enough to know not to cause trouble. I said I was flattered, but I had plans and really needed to get going. He just stared at me for a long time and gave me my license and just turned and walked away. I got back in my car and pulled away thinking the whole thing was really weird. I kept going, but couldn't help notice that the car behind me started following me again. Then again, it was a straight shot with just a couple of turns, probably going the same way I was. But it became evident something was up when a pickup truck came roaring up and passed both of us and then swerved in front of me. I flipped the driver off for scaring me and yelled a little bit, but I let it go. I was more worried about the guy behind me. Then all of a sudden, the truck started slowing down, and the guy behind me flipped on his brights. It was then that I knew something was very wrong. The high beams went off, and the truck got a little faster, but after a few minutes, the car behind me started flicking the beams on and off, and I was really starting to lose it at this point. I'm out in the middle of fucking nowhere, and these two guys are messing with me. And I'm a tough woman, but I was really scared at that point. I saw a sign that 15 was coming up, and I remember that I think 15 can take me to another town before the interstate Christy's grandfather told me to take. We came to an intersection where the right-hand turn is supposed to happen, and the truck just stopped in front of me and didn't move. The car behind me got up so close I couldn't even see his lights, and we all just sat there. I burst into tears and screamed out, "What do you want?" before the truck turned in the opposite direction I was going. I gingerly moved up and made the right and floored it. The car behind me didn't follow, and I was still in tears and sobbing as I drove along quickly. But less than a mile later, I saw lights behind me coming up fast, and the same thing happened again. Again, I was boxed in, now screaming with tears rolling down my face. I didn't know what to do, but I saw signs that a town called Mount Vernon was coming up, and that was the biggest town before I could get back on 5764. More cars started popping up, and we got into town, and I started to feel a little bit better, but was still scared they might try something, and no one in this town would care. I saw a Hardee's coming up and thought I'd go in there and ask for help, and one good thing happened, and one bad thing happened. I got stuck in a drive-through lane, not realizing that's where I was. But the truck didn't realize what I was doing, so he kept going on straight. The car behind me got cut off by a guy also going into the drive-through, so he was still following, but now 2 cars behind. I got to the little order box and screamed that I needed the police, and someone had to help me. The poor girl working the drive-through said she'd get a manager, and eventually I got to the window, and they said they had called the police and to pull into the parking lot to sort things out. A manager guy came rushing out and stood by my car, but the other car drove off and screeched into the street and drove away. The police came and I told them everything, and they took a report, but there wasn't anything else they could do other than keep an eye out for the truck and car based on my description. When I told them about the police officer, I didn't think was a cop, they took it seriously, but again, there was still little they could do. One of them asked me if I wanted to stay in town for the night, but I said I really needed to just get out of there. So they followed me to the interstate and got on with me for about 15 miles, making sure that I wasn't being followed. One pulled up alongside me and gave me a "you okay" look, and I nodded and gave a thumbs up. They both got off at an exit, and I sped the rest of the way to Carbondale. I have no idea what those guys were trying to do other than scare me, but they really got to my core. Once I got to Christie's, I melted down all over again, still so scared. Nothing else happened, and I did enjoy my weekend there and hooked up with what I thought was a hunk at the time. Hey, girls need love too. And Christy spent a ton of time apologizing for sending me out to her grandparents. So, all ended well, but even today, this many years later, every time I see someone flick on their high beams behind me, I freak out a little bit. I don't think that trip will ever leave my mind. Angry People in the Woods, submitted by Single Track Sean. So this happened back in 2010 in northern Pennsylvania. Anyone from that area knows that there's choice mountain biking, and back then I had more time to ride than I do now, so at least twice a week and once per weekend I was out there making every minute count. One place that I would frequent was state land that butted up against private plots and farms and such. The farmers were super cool to everyone that used the trails as long as they didn't trespass, and I've had more than one long conversation with them, making me forget why I was out there in the first place. However, out there, not everyone is so nice. My friend Taylor and I found that out one summer. This story takes place over 2 summer months of that year. Taylor was one of my best riding mates, and we teamed up a lot on relay races and such. One late afternoon, we were navigating some gnarly single-track stuff that looped between a steep climb and a fairly long downhill section. Fairly long equals about a mile. There were tons of rocks and roots and down trees for obstacles, so it's really technical, and you have to pay attention there. As we're rocking our way through things, We came across a guy and his girlfriend on the side of the trail, and she was obviously hurt. We stopped and asked if they needed anything and if they were okay, and she was, but she still was kind of in rough shape. The guy told us that someone rigged up something on the trail that caused his girlfriend to have an accident, and the first thing we thought was, well, this is pretty technical. Maybe this section is beyond her capabilities. Later, Taylor and I noticed the racing tag on her helmet that was for experts, so that ruled that out. The guy pointed to a log in the path meant to be a rideable obstacle, but on one side, someone had dug out about 2 feet down across the trail and put a thin layer of sticks and covered it with dirt and moss. Anyone bunny hopping the log would have sailed clear, but someone else just wheeling over it would have gone ass over handlebars, as their front wheel would have surely smashed through that crap and right into the hole. That's exactly what had happened to this woman. All 4 of us talked about who would do something this insane, and got to filling in the hole. The woman's front wheel was bent a little, but not tacoed, so the 2 slowly rode off, and we told them the goings were safe as we'd just come that way. Later, over a beer, Taylor and I talked about that incident. He looked at me and said, "Dude, you know that wasn't another biker that did that, right?" I agreed and thought about what kind of asshole would go out of their way to do something like that. I stopped thinking about it until my next ride out there when I went solo. I was more cautious than usual, and it kind of ruined the ride. After a bit, I got over my tenseness and got to one of my favorite downhill sections where I loved putting my butt over the back wheel and just really going for it. But for the already stated reason, I did hold back a little. Something still didn't feel right. About halfway down, I stopped completely, and my intuition was right on. You couldn't really see it in the dark of the woods. It was light out, but you know how it gets darker in the forest. But there was something there. Right at about what was chin or neck level on me was a piece of braided fishing line tied taut between 2 trees. It was right after a really sharp turn, and anyone with speed and my size would never have had time to stop. I looked around and shook my head. Another frickin' trap. I took out my multi-tool and cut that shit down and went on my way, even more wary. For the next 2 weeks, I didn't go back there. One night, I was on a local MTB forum and saw someone had started a topic about what was going on out there. Me and Taylor weren't the only ones who had encountered stuff. There were at least 5 other people who had found similar traps all around the trails, but mostly in one section. I started to notice that most of them were on parts that ran alongside private land. I thought about it and realized that I never really saw any farmers or anyone else for that matter out there. As I mentioned, other sections of the trail had people that would chat us up. But in that section, I never saw a soul. Everyone agreed to let everyone else on the forum know what they had found and where, and to take pictures if they could. We were going to take everything to the police and park rangers. After a few days, nothing was noticed. But then, suddenly, things started to get worse. More traps were noticed that were meant to take people down, but now some of them had tons of broken glass and shit in the dirt and grass. Some logs had been set up against deadfalls, so if someone were to ride over them, the movement would cause the dead trees to fall onto the path. Now it was getting serious. One day, Taylor and I were out there, and he had ridden ahead a little bit. And that's when I saw them. 2 guys I'd never seen before were down a short hill, and they came out onto the trail. They had shovels and bags of who knows what, and after they looked around, they started digging a hole next to a puddle. Most mountain bikers know to ride through puddles, but noobs will often ride around the sides of a puddle because they don't want to get wet or don't want to gauge how deep the puddle is. This was a trap obviously set for them. They didn't see me as I had stopped to the side of some trees at the top of the hill when I had noticed them. I watched them for a little bit, and then I heard Taylor yell out, "Yo, Sean, you riding or you hiding?" He must have turned around looking for me. The 2 guys heard him too, and they looked up and after a minute grabbed their shit and ran back into the woods. I rode down the hill to where they were and saw the little hole they were working on. Taylor rode up and asked what the hell I was doing, and I told him, and we both scanned the woods, seeing nothing. Then we heard a shotgun blast not too far away, and we immediately got out of there. We reported everything to the police, but my description was pretty lame. I vowed I was not going back there, but Taylor said maybe they'd lay off if they thought we'd seen them. And I thought it was over. 2 days later, a guy I raced with once in a while got hurt really bad after a fall on a downhill section after someone shot him with fireworks. I don't know what it was, but I heard he said it was like a bunch of shit exploded right in his face and it shot him off the trail, and he cracked into a tree. Fucked his back up and his new stump jumper. Now the police were starting to look into things. After they patrolled out there with some guys on quads, things died down again and there were no more traps. Taylor convinced me it was cool to go again, and I did. And this time we went with a third friend, Mindy. She was and still is a beast on 2 wheels, although she's a roadie now. Anyway, we were out having a great time and decided to stop for a break. We were in the questionable section, but none of us were uneasy. We were just chatting and getting ready for the push back out. Then, Mindy stopped talking mid-sentence and stared over our shoulders. On the trail were 2 men wearing what looked like demon Halloween masks. They were literally maybe 20 feet away, and one was holding up a dead rabbit in one hand and a knife in the other. As we stood there looking at him in disbelief, the guy began stabbing the rabbit and then pointed the knife at us. I heard a noise behind us, and I turned to see 2 more guys with masks on, and one was holding a shotgun. None of us said a word until I whispered, "What the fuck are we gonna do now?" Mindy finally yelled out, "Look, we don't want any trouble. Let us ride out of here and we won't come back, okay?" I was thinking, yeah, they're really gonna go for that. A maniac who was stabbing an animal and pointing a knife at us with his 3 fucked up friends, and they're just gonna let us leave, right? What seemed like 5 minutes passed with these guys just staring at us. And Mindy yelled out again, "Okay, we're leaving." Then, as quietly as they showed up, all 4 of them went back into the woods without saying a word. "Well, what do you think?" I said quietly. "Let's just go," said Taylor, and he got on his bike. We all started pedaling away, all eyes on the part of the trail where they had just stood. It was Mindy, Taylor, then me. Right after we passed the exact spot where they were, something came flying out of the trees, and it was the guts of the rabbit, and they splattered on Mindy and Taylor. How they missed me, I don't know. We jammed it into overdrive and really rocked the shit out of there. Had we been in a race, we'd all have placed first, second, and third. We got back to our vehicles and called the cops, and they came out and took one look at the gore on Mindy and Taylor, and then called for people to head out into the woods on ATVs again. They never found anything, and as far as I know, that was the last anyone saw of those guys, and there were no more traps either. I stayed away from that place for a couple of years, but I have been back. It's still great riding and it's safe, but every time I get to that place where we stopped and saw those guys, I half expect to see them again in those demon masks. Let me tell you, I don't stop. I always haul ass right through. The Legend of Blue Dark by Billy P. It was the summer before 8th grade, and I was going to have a campout. I was really excited because I was going to have all my friends over, and we were going to do one of my favorite things, and that was to camp out. My best friend, who I will call Jerry, had gotten there early to help me set up camp and the tent and everything else. Everyone else started getting there around 7 o'clock. We all went inside to eat and then decided what to do for the rest of the night. I knew I wanted to go in the woods and play war games, and after we ate it, we decided to watch a little TV, and then we got bored of that, so we decided to go into the woods eventually. Obviously, you can't have a good campout unless you have a good ghost story. Well, the ghost story I was going to tell them was true as far as I knew, and here's the story I told them. 3 years ago, I was in my bed and it was storming outside. I can't sleep well in thunderstorms, so I was just lying there wide awake when all of a sudden I heard a loud crash. I got up out of my bed and rushed to the window to see what had happened. Outside, I saw an 18-wheeler lying on its side in a ditch about 200 yards from my house. About 15 minutes later, the police arrived and got everything underway as far as their investigation. The weird thing was that the truck had crashed right by an old cemetery up the road. I went back to bed and finally fell asleep. The next morning, I heard my mom and dad talking about what the paper had to say about the crash. They said that the police said the 18-wheeler truck was carrying some sort of toxic chemical to a dump site somewhere, and that the driver had lost control and ran into the ditch and then turned on its side. Here's the weird thing. The police never mentioned the condition of the driver. But my sister's boyfriend had an uncle on the police force, and he said they never found a body. The doors of the truck cab had been jammed open, and the chemical had somehow leaked over into it, and apparently that ate the man's body up. My neighbor says every now and then he stands on his back porch and can see the figure of a glowing something running along the edge of the woods. That was the end of my story. But truth is, that really did happen. However, I didn't really believe the part about the man's body being eaten up by chemicals. I was just telling my friends that's what I heard. My neighbor does say he sees a figure every now and then, and the police supposedly never did find the driver's body. I don't know if that's true. I mean, if it was a ghost, because I don't believe in ghosts. After I told my friends the story, we were pretty deep in the woods, just walking along and talking, and I told everyone to turn their flashlights off and just walk in the dark. It wasn't dark enough for us not to see where we were going because it was a perfectly clear night. But after a few minutes, we turned the lights back on, and right when we did, Jerry said, "Billy, what is that?" I turned and froze dead in my tracks. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. Finally, after a couple of seconds and what seemed like an eternity, I said, "That's him, y'all." There, standing about 40 yards away, stood what seemed to be like a bright blue glow in the form of a human. My neighbor saw a green glow, but this was not green. It was like the color of the ocean off the coast of Florida. It was just a bright blue glow. What got me is when I shined the flashlight on it, it disappeared, so I moved the flashlight just to the right of it to take the light off of it again, and it reappeared. All of this took place within about 10 seconds. Then all of a sudden, it started moving towards us, and believe me, it was fast. We were so scared a car couldn't have caught us as we ran away. I mean, we were moving faster than I ever thought we could. As we were running, I heard it scream or roar or make some sound, and all I know is that was the most horrible sound I had ever heard. And that made us run all the more fast. We ran to my neighbor's house first, and my friend, who I'll call Danny, practically ripped the screen door off the hinges trying to get in the house. The funny thing is, Danny is about as big as a toothpick and has no strength whatsoever. At least he hadn't been strong up until that point. He didn't even know my neighbors, but he didn't care about nothing but getting away. He just ran into my neighbor's house and grabbed a hold of Miss Clara, who lived there, and hugged her as a little child grabs his mom after not seeing her for a whole day. We were all so scared we couldn't talk straight and tell my neighbors what we had seen. Finally, they took us back to my house, which was only about another 100 yards away. We were still shaken up and couldn't talk straight, and my mom was trying to get what happened out of us, but we just couldn't say anything right. Then my dad came in from the living room after hearing all the fuss. He kept trying to figure out what had happened, and it didn't take him long. And this is what made me realize everything was real. My dad looked me straight in the eye after about 5 minutes and said, "You saw him, didn't you?" I was shocked. My dad knew what had happened. He said, "I told you not to take them back there near the cemetery. I told you not to, but you did it anyway, didn't you?" I asked him, "Dad, how did you know?" And he said, "'Cause I've seen him too." He told me that he saw him once late at night coming home from the garden, and it chased after him. But he never told me that because he didn't want to frighten me. I knew then what I had seen was no joke. There was no prank someone had played on us, and I certainly wasn't playing a prank on my friends. What I had seen was a real live ghost, or should I say a real dead ghost. After a few hours, we just started referring to the ghost as Blue Dark, and from this day on, it's a well-known story to the people around my neighborhood. I've never been back to that spot, at least not at night anyway. I don't think I ever will either. I do know this. I don't blame anyone for not believing in ghosts, but I know what I saw, and it wasn't right. In case you're wondering, this story took place in Natchez, Mississippi. It was the scariest time of my life. Where Do You Think You're Going? By Not Your Anthem. Going into college, I was pretty naive about the way of the world and way too trusting of strangers. This led to some interesting situations, but one of the scariest encounters I've ever had, even to this day, occurred in February of my freshman year. A little background. My freshman year, I lived in a dorm on a floor full of girls. We were all friends, and if one of us got invited to a house party, frat party, or whatever, all of us would tag along. I didn't know a single person coming into college, and I really wanted to make friends, so I just tried to go with the flow. While I've never been a big drinker, I just don't like the taste, this was not a problem for the other girls. They went hard. It was kind of impressive, actually. Anyway, on this particular February weekend, I can't remember if it was a Friday or Saturday night, I was coming down with a bad cold. I was walking back to my room after grabbing some food from the dining hall, and right as I got to my floor, one of the girls told me there was a house party going on that night on Weston Street. Weston Street was less than a 15-minute walk from our dorm, and a lot of upperclassmen lived there. The parties were always wild, and being invited to one was a big deal for freshman girls, or so we thought at the time. I told my floor mates I wasn't really in the mood to go out, but they convinced me it would be fun, and if I got there and really just wanted to head back to the dorm, we'd leave. So as it gets darker and 9 o'clock rolls around, our floor starts to pregame for the next few hours. I only had a few beers, nothing excessive, but by the time we finally left at 11, most of us were pretty drunk. It's important to note that there had been a slew of sexual assaults reported at my school around this time, and the university was advising students to travel in groups. There were about 20 of us or so walking to this party, and I really didn't think anything more about it at the time. When we finally got there, it was super crowded, like you couldn't stand anywhere without brushing up against someone. And it was definitely not a fun type of party if you're sober, and I was. I chugged a few mixed drinks, got a pretty good buzz going, and tried to be social and hang out with my friends, but I was starting to feel pretty bad from my cold, and honestly, I was really sick of people bumping into me and spilling their drinks. All I wanted to do was find someone to walk back with me to the dorm, so I could pop some Advil PM and go to sleep. I looked around and spotted Lauren by the archway to the kitchen. She was one of my floor mates. I asked her if she'd be willing to head back to the dorm with me, to which she replied that her booty call was there and she was trying to bang him. I continued searching for my other friends, and their stories are pretty much all the same. Too drunk, hooking up, having fun, etc. I finally found someone willing to walk with me, and I felt a wave of relief. I really didn't want to walk back alone, and this area wasn't well lit. We left the party and began the tedious uphill walk back to the dorm. It was midnight, 10 degrees out, and I went to college in a state filled with mountains, so the campus is full of steep hills. As we were walking back, Katie, the girl who I was walking with, spotted a few of her sorority sisters driving by, and they asked her if she wanted to go to another party with them. I was like, "Katie, you said you'd walk back with me," to which she replied, "Yeah, but it's like a 10-minute walk from here. Nothing's going to happen. You'll be fine." I asked if I could at least get a ride back from her friends, but they told me the car was full and drove off with Katie. So now I'm on this dimly lit sidewalk by myself, and in my head I'm thinking, well, isn't this freaking great? so I started to head back alone. And at first I was a little freaked out because I've never walked home by myself before, and I was thinking about those assault stories. But I passed a few people and no one said anything, so I began to relax a little bit. They were just stories. Nothing was going to happen. I came upon a really well-lit part of campus, and I was happy. In my mind, I thought if I was in a location that was really well-lit, I was 100% safe. Again, freshman naivete. As I was coming up on this well-lit intersection, the kind where there's 4 crosswalks, so a square is essentially formed, I noticed a group of 8 or 10 guys on the other side of the sidewalk parallel to me walking in the opposite direction. I was walking uphill. They were walking down. They looked like the stereotypical douchebag frat boy jock guys, and were being boisterous. I kept my head down, kept walking, and didn't think anything of them until I heard, "Look, boys, there's a hot one." They all started calling out phrases and catcalls. "Hey, baby, what are you doing all alone out here by yourself? You need a man to warm you up?" "Sexy mama." "Hey, cutie, come over here for a minute." You get the picture. My danger alarms were going off in my head, but I told myself that it was fine, and if I just kept walking and ignored them, they would lose interest. As I continued to walk up the hill, I noticed that they now changed direction and were walking the same way I was. I didn't say a word to them up until this point, and it was starting to piss them off. I was now by the crosswalk of the intersection, but I can't walk across the way I need to because then I'd have to pass them directly. I look around for someone, anyone, to help me, but there's literally not a soul in sight. It's just me and them. At this point, I was starting to panic, and I was running through my options in my head. Could I call someone? Everyone I know either is out partying or won't pick up or are asleep. Call the police? Yes, but would they get here fast enough? It was also at the point I noticed they started to walk across the street towards me. I can still remember the look on one of the guy's faces as he marched across the intersection and yelled, "Hey, bitch! We're talking to you! Where the fuck do you think you're going?" I kid you not. My limbs felt like jelly. I guess my brain went into autopilot mode, though, because as these guys were walking towards me, I ran across the crosswalk to my left. It didn't really make any sense, but I was just trying to get away from them at that point. And then crossed the next crosswalk so that we were all now diagonal from each other. And I heard one of the guys say, "You know what? I'm sick of this shit. You, go get her." And 2 guys started sprinting towards me. You know that feeling where you're on a roller coaster and when you go down the first hill your stomach drops? That's exactly how I felt. I couldn't believe it. I took off running as fast as I could, and if someone clocked my speed, I'm sure they'd tell me I broke my school's 400-meter dash record. I literally ran all the way back to my dorm, and I didn't look back until I was at the main entrance. By the grace of God, they didn't catch me, and I'm not sure when they stopped chasing me, but I didn't care. Even as I type this, I still get chills thinking about it. If they had caught me, who knows what they would have done. I'm not a very strong girl. They could have knocked me out and told someone passing by I was their drunk sister, or girlfriend, or friend, whatever, who had just passed out and they were taking me home. It could have ended very badly for me. When I got into my dorm room, I sank to the floor and cried. I didn't sleep that night, and I've never walked home alone again. I'm sure it goes without saying, but psycho, rapey college guys, let's not meet again. The Water Tower by John G. This occurrence happened to my friend Colin and myself in about 1959. At the time, we were about 13 and still attending Hagley Roman Catholic High School. The time was about 8 or 8:30 in the evening, and the month I no longer remember, but it was in the Northern Hemisphere autumn, winter because it was dark quite early. The local town was Kidderminster in the county of Worcestershire, roughly in the middle of England. The area was Birchen Coppice, a housing estate owned by the local council. It was then a respectable area, as it was only probably 8 years old, I believe the area is now more of a slum, but I haven't been there in 33 years, as we moved in the middle 60s, and then I relocated to Australia in 67. A bit of geography is needed here. The street we lived on was Kinver Ave. The rear of our houses backed onto undeveloped bushland, which went onto some pretty unspoiled countryside in most directions. However, the area just to the rear and to the south was called the Burlish Camp. This camp was built in World War II as a repatriation hospital for U.S. servicemen. After the war, it was used to house Polish war refugees, and as children, we played, mixed, and schooled with their children. In the middle 50s, the people were relocated and the whole area was knocked flat, except for one lonely structure called the Water Tower. As the name suggests it was just that, a very large brick tower. From childhood memory, maybe 50 by 50 by 80 to 100 feet high, with a giant water tank in the top. It was used to supply the Burlish camp with water, and there were 8 windows, 4 at the rear and 4 at the front. The first pair were about 30 feet off the ground, and the next pair maybe another 30 feet up. There was a steel door on the southern side, but it was bricked up in the middle 50s, and there was never any electricity to it, and it was now inaccessible. Back to my story. Colin and I were just hanging out at the end of our street under a streetlight. This streetlight was at the junction where our tarred street met with a wide dirt track that led over to the Burlish camp, straight past the water tower, and down onto a small town called Stourport-on-Severn, about 4 miles further on. During our conversation, Colin said, "Hey, look at those lights in the water tower." The tower was maybe a quarter of a mile away, but we could make it out in the moonlight. I was quite surprised, because we could see some form of moving or blinking light in the window area of the tower. The color of the light did not appear as normal to what we call light, meaning candles or incandescent light, which always seems to have a warm and yellow content. This light was very sallow white to opaque. A short time later, about 20 yards from us on the dirt track at an angle of about 45 degrees, we could see a light, the same color light that was in the tower. From this point on, in the following events, I have no recollection of time. I remember we thought it was someone on a bicycle because the light seemed to fall to the ground. We started giggling, saying it must be someone drunk and maybe they fell off their bike. In the next instance, I remember myself drawn and staring wide-eyed at the figure of a man, particularly at his face. It was on its side, very distinguishable features, a portrait if you will. A vertical flat forehead, long pointed nose, sunken, very staring eyes. Because my concentration was so intense and right on his face, I didn't seem to observe any body detail, except the lack of normal motion movements. He appeared to be floating along, opaque. We could see right through him. The ground all around us seemed to crackle as if Rice Krispies were being trodden on. I picked up a stone and threw it in his direction, and Colin was pulling at my left arm, screaming at me to not throw it. The stone fell short but in line as it hit the soft grass with a thud, and the man brought up his arm as if to protect his face. My legs went to jelly. I fell to the ground and the vision disappeared, and Colin ran off, holding his ears and screaming as he stumbled, running through people's front gardens. But I vividly recall floating above the streetlight. I can remember details such as the bird droppings on top of the post. I watched Colin pulling my left arm, me throwing the stone, collapsing on the ground, and Colin running away screaming. The next thing I remembered, I was lying on the ground, and a lady, her name was Mrs. Sayers, was bending over me, asking if I was okay and what was all the shouting. I ran home very scared. Colin lost his hearing for 2 days, and we made a pact not to tell for fear of ridicule. Anyhow, as time went by, we told, and we did get laughed at, but I could never see anything funny about it. This occurrence left an indelible mark on me. Some years later, at age 16, I had been out fox hunting with a companion. Peter wasn't a local and was unfamiliar with our area, and we were heading back to my home on a dirt motorcycle at about 2:30 or 3 in the morning. Peter was pillion, and I was riding. We were directly in front of the tower, a few hundred yards away, and Peter shouted to me, "Hey, who lives over there?" I said, "Over where?" as I concentrated on riding with no lights. "Over there, to your left." And as I looked, to my left, of course, it was the water tower. My eyes nearly popped, and my jaw dropped. I was aghast. Each of the windows in the tower had those same lights as years before, but even more startling, we could distinctly see people, like figures, lined up as if waiting to go in where the door used to be. The figures weren't distinguishable separately, but were the same opaque color as the little white man I had seen so many years ago. That little dirt motorbike became the fastest bike in the land. Many years later, talking to my late father, we were passing the time talking about our family, being kids, where we lived, neighbors, and the like. Dad was telling me about the post-war years, 56 to 60, and how times were hard, and 5 or 6 of the local ladies would work continuous night shifts in a manufacturing plant in the above-mentioned town called Starport-on-Severn. He said they would cycle 8 to 10 miles to work each way instead of 3 miles shortcut through the Brolish camp. I said, why would they waste their time with that? And he replied, Mrs. Hawker next door says that none of the women felt good about going that way. It always seemed very still and eerie when they went past the water tower. And when they came home in the morning, the birds were singing, but not up there by the tower. It was always still and quiet. Dad gave off a chuckle, and I didn't. I knew just what they meant. Well, in the mid to late 60s, the tower was to be removed to make way for a communications repeater station. The local news was there to cover the Big Bang, and it took 3 days of drilling and explosives to finally fell the tower. The experts were scratching their heads. They couldn't understand how it had stayed up through so many explosive attempts. I have an idea. Not the Words of a Rational Mind by Opinionated IMO. He started out by telling me little things about himself. Just random tidbits, ordinary by any barometer. The old man sitting beside me in the car dealership waiting room just wanted to chat. I got the feeling it was cathartic for him to share his miscellaneous wit and wisdom. He seemed harmless enough. I even smiled in modest encouragement. It seemed like the polite thing to do. The customer lounge was filled with the same old boring magazines as every other car waiting room in the world. As an extrovert, I don't mind hearing this voluntary confession from this man. It was bound to be more interesting than a 3-year-old dog-eared copy of Road and Driver. The old man had a matter-of-fact conspiratorial air about him. Frankly, it made me feel a little uneasy, but I thought I was imagining things. He spoke as if we'd been friends for 30 years, yet I've never met him before. His eyes remained wide open, and he rarely blinked. Each of his new white-knuckled admissions submerged me into another level of his very disturbing personal life. What started out as a run-of-the-mill bland set of his daily occurrences rapidly devolved into a series of diabolical tales. I tried to maintain the pretense of neutrality in my expressions, but the act was largely unnecessary. The old man would have unloaded his jaw-dropping bombshells to Bozo the Clown. He kept dishing out his unbelievable stories in rapid-fire succession. My participation level was minimal and counterproductive. If I dared to request clarification, the interruption distracted him, and finally I learned to just shut up and listen. Like a train wreck, the details were horrifying, but I couldn't seem to look away from the visceral carnage. He explained early on in the gripping saga that his former spouse was a prostitute. At the time he accepted how she earned her money, but he couldn't bear to witness it in person. Their household rule was that she had to have all business conducted and completed while he was away at work. One day, an appointment ran long, and he walked in on his wife servicing a customer. His eyes grew wide with menace as he described the fury in his heart, his voice growing noticeably louder. was chock full of raw emotion, and the entire waiting room was in rapt attention as we waited breathlessly as he described what happened next. The old man mentioned that he was a carpenter by trade. As is often the case in crimes of passion, he selected an instrument of vengeance that he was intimately familiar with. He grabbed a hammer and proceeded to batter the John's cranium with a series of death blows. He described copious amounts of blood flying with each furious swing. Try to imagine the stunned reaction of hearing this pulse-pounding story by a roomful of startled housewives waiting for an oil change. The hair on my neck stood on end. And the old man seemed kind of oblivious to how this tale was affecting anybody around him. He was reliving the moment. He was right back there. In his mind, he was still swinging that bloody hammer. He'd actually stood up near the end and was vigorously pantomiming the story. I didn't doubt the truth of his tale for a moment, but anyone admitting to attempted murder would surely be in prison, right? And here he was, a free man, regaling his homicidal frenzy to a room of captivated folks at a local Ford dealership. I asked him what happened next. I was terrified he was going to say that he buried the body in his backyard to cover up his crime. Instead, he explained that he was found unfit to stand trial and institutionalized. After a series of psychotropic meds and years of shock therapy, he was eventually released on his own recognizance. In the antithesis of storytelling, the service manager walked in and interrupted. The guy's vehicle was ready, thus ending his terrifying testimonial. The little old man said goodbye, paid his bill, and left. His words gripped and entertained us until the very end, but they were not those of a rational man. Somehow, I feel a little less safe that he is a free man among us. Escorted from the Woods by Anonymous. It was a few weeks after Christmas, and I was out taking pictures for some new projects. I was off-road about 15 miles with 12 to 14 inches of snow on the logging roads. I had driven these roads many times throughout the seasons, and my truck was more than able to get me through the drifts. It was about 2 in the afternoon when I entered the forest to one of my favorite places to shoot, an old abandoned homestead. About 3 or 4 crumbling old log buildings are there and make interesting subject matter. I wanted to catch the right light, and there were some older snowmobile tracks under the week old powder, but no other signs of people being around. It was about -10 and no wind, so a nice winter day for photography. The shadows were getting longer, so I got out of my truck and started to walk towards the edge of the clearing. I shot for about an hour and a half, when I got the feeling I wasn't alone anymore. I have seen coyotes, moose, deer, and the odd bear here and there, but the wind was blowing from behind me, so they would have smelled my scent and vanished. There was a rumored wolf pack around, but I think I would have heard them. The aspen stands are difficult to see into, and your eyes can play tricks on you, so I shrugged everything off to nerves and kept looking for that ultimate sunset shot. I looked towards my truck about 500 yards to the south of me. I had wandered pretty far, and I leave it open and keys in it out in the woods just in case I fall down or drop them in the snow. I figured I had enough pictures for the day and put my camera in my backpack and then started back towards the truck. This is where it gets strange. The snow was knee-deep and tough going. Again, I got the feeling I was being watched, and I glanced over my shoulder, but nothing was there. I kept going, following the tree line about 30 feet away along a frozen creek. And then I heard it. Some small twigs snapping in the woods about 150 yards away. This is thick bush with 1 or 2 feet of deadfall along with powder snow about 2 feet deep. Not an easy going for any creature. I picked up my pace to a fast trot. I didn't need to meet up with a bear who was yet to go to sleep for the winter. But now I started to hear actual footsteps, and it or they were running through the woods, either alongside my path or towards me. I didn't wait to find out. I ran for my truck, which was now about 100 yards from me, and the sun was nearly gone by now, which made it even more scary. I darted across the clearing, and I reached the truck with the trees snapping 200 feet away. There was a definite grunting now, like an elk, but much deeper. I got to my truck and jumped in, and as I fired it up, I started to turn it around. I saw the pine trees in front of me shaking, and the snow falling off in the last light of the day in my truck lights. I went back 2 weeks later, and in that area I found snapped-off 6-inch saplings, but that was about it, as it had snowed 2 or 3 feet over those weeks. This was at an elevation of about 4,200 feet. Later, I told a friend about this, and he said Bigfoot, and told me of an encounter on the same road which was far more dangerous the year prior. I have since moved away from BC. I have shot, camped, and ridden horseback throughout the North American backcountry and encountered many animals, human and non-human. But the sounds I heard that night were not of any animal I had heard before. The Guy Who Knew My Schedule by Girl Rediscovered. I moved from the city I used to live in to another town about 20 miles outside of it about 10 years ago. On Saturdays, it was recently becoming my habit to go wandering around the city, have lunch in what used to be my regular drinking spot, and then get a train home. Yesterday, I went into the city to see Deadpool 2. Afterwards, I wandered down to the bar and took my usual seat. I was somewhat later going in than usual. I ordered my food and a soft drink and a coffee, and I sat up on the dais with my back to the door and got out my Kindle and started reading. I've been coming here for over 20 years, so the regulars all know me. Anyway, this short, scruffy guy walks in and taps me on the arm and says hello. I reply and go back to my book. The 2 guys sitting at the next table looked up and watched this guy walk in. He walked the length of the bar, then stood by a wall and waited. The waitress brought me my meal and commented, "Is that someone you know?" I gently shook my head, and she walked back to the bar and picked up the phone. The strange guy is now looking at his watch. He comes back over to me and says, "Don't you normally go home by now?" I've got a mouthful of pizza, and one of the guys at the next table says something about me not needing permission to be out late. The strange man walks out, but hides just around the corner of the door. By the time I'm finished eating, the pub's doorman walks in, earlier than he usually starts. He looks at me and says, "Don't move." The waitress brings me over the coffee, and as I started to say thanks, she said the coffee is on her because strange guy is still hiding around the corner. Doorman goes up to the strange guy and tells him to move on, then tells me to stay until he's sure the guy is gone. 20 minutes later, I have to get up to go because it's getting late and the trains get really irregular. A biker guy from the next table walked me across the road to the station and put me on the train. Just after he leaves, strange guy runs onto my train and sits 2 rows in front of me. At this point, a gang of football fans get on, celebrating after a match. One of them sees strange guy watching me and dives into the seat next to me. "Hello, baby. So glad I caught you on the way home. What do you reckon to grabbing a takeaway on the way home?" He pulled me close like we are snogging and says, "I'm an off-duty cop. I don't like the look of that guy. Where are you getting off?" I whispered my stop into his ear and we continued to fake cuddle and giggle. Strange guy is raging at this point and got off at the next stop. The cop stayed on the train with me and even walked me home. I did talk to his wife on the phone and backed up his explanation of why he was being late home and congratulated her on having such a great husband. Cop recommended I put in a complaint to the police, but I think I'll just change my routine for a few weeks until strange guy gets bored. So, strange guy in Glasgow? Let's not meet. Celtic supporting policeman and his wife, waitresses and bikers, thank you all. The Old House, submitted by Tester's Choice. I grew up in a suburb of Atlanta. There were a lot of newish neighborhoods that had been built up over the years, But back in the 70s, there wasn't as much as there is now. That's life, I guess. So when some developers were going to build one of these new housing developments, they were also going to knock down this old estate that was the so-called haunted house by all the kids in town. We would always sneak out there and scare each other with tales of ghosts and stuff we'd heard from other kids and our siblings. As far as I really know, it was just a huge old run-down house. When we heard that it was going to be torn down, we decided to go out to it one last time before it was gone forever. Of course, we had to go at night for maximum scare effect, right? There were 5 of our gang: me, Joe, Bill, Keith, and Emma, who was Keith's little sister, and quite a tomboy. We got flashlights and headed out, probably telling our parents we were going somewhere else. We knew they didn't want us out there, especially with the demolition coming up soon. It was about a 15-minute walk to get there, and when we did get there, we saw that a lot of the trees that were once around it had already been cut down. Far down a lane was the place, and it was just getting dark. The house was massive. I don't know how many bedrooms and other rooms, but there were at least 6 bedrooms. It was totally unsafe to be out there, but kids are kids no matter where you go. Joe was talking about all this ghost stuff, getting everyone else scared, and Emma was telling Keith that we shouldn't go inside. We were all laughing at her because we knew the stories weren't true. We got up to the house, and Joe and I tried the door. It was locked or jammed, so we couldn't get in that way, and Emma looked happier. But we really wanted to get in, so we moved around to the back of the house, and holy smokes, a huge portion of the back had already fallen down, like someone had just grabbed the whole wall and yanked it outward. It was still light enough for us to see, and we could make out that there was some furniture and stuff still inside. I started to walk over the rubble with the guys right behind me, and Emma still saying we should leave. I really wish we had listened to her. Once we got inside, it was a little darker, so we switched on our lights and began exploring. Bill and Joe decided to head upstairs, and they said that they could feel the steps sagging beneath their weight, but it was holding up. I was checking out a front parlor with Keith and Emma, and that's when we heard the noise. It sounded like a person coughing, but it was coming from down the hall somewhere. I went over to check it out. Maybe there was someone else out there that was doing the same thing we were. But there was no one. I could hear the guys moving around slowly upstairs, so I knew it wasn't them. And then it came again. This time behind us, opposite of where we first heard it. I looked at Keith, and he said, "What was that?" I shook my head and then yelled out, "Hey, who's there?" No answer. It was weird. I walked down the hall to see if someone else was over there, but nobody was, or so I thought. While I was telling Keith no one was there, a closet door creaked open, and 2 men in their 20s, I guessed, came shambling out with these weird grins on their faces. It's been decades since this happened, but I'll always remember how they looked. They were creepy and wearing stained clothes and had dirt on their faces and arms and hands. Without saying a word, they walked towards us, and one pointed at Emma, and they both kept grinning creepily. I turned, ran into Keith, who then bumped into Emma, and she fell down. I tried to run and grabbed her by the arm and started pulling her along with me, and she let out a scream, more of pain than fright, I'm guessing. Keith grabbed her other arm, and we got her on her feet, and she screamed again. Now, I can't be sure, but I'm almost positive one of the guys said, "I don't like it when they scream." Keith doesn't remember that to this day, but I'm pretty sure that's what I heard. We ran out of the room and down the hall to the way out, and Keith yelled for the other guys to get out of the house. Someone else was in there. Emma was crying and wailing at this point, and I'm just trying to get her to move faster. Bill shouts back, "What? What's going on?" And I just yelled, "Get out!" I heard thudding upstairs as we scrambled over the rubble and back into the grassy yard, and I looked back to see Bill running after us. We ran to the edge of the trees, and then curiosity got at us as we looked back to see if the men were chasing us. That's when we realized Joe was not with us. "Bill, where's Joe?" I asked. Bill said he thought he was right behind him. But of course he wasn't. Emma was still crying, and I told Keith to take her home and get some help. Bill and I'd go back and look for Joe. He nodded and started running off with his sister right behind him, trying to keep up. Bill and I talked about a plan to go back in the house to get Joe, even though we were scared and didn't know where he was. We scrambled back over the rubble and went inside, and we tiptoed through the rooms until we heard voices talking low and something that sounded like paper being crumbled up. We heard steps coming our way, so we ducked into a front room, and we noticed the two men walking by, talking quietly. Again, we couldn't make out what they were saying. All was quiet again after a bit, except for the crumpling sound. I peeked down the hall to the room where we had seen the men and moved towards it. The sound got louder, and both of us went into the room, and we saw legs sticking out of the closet. It was Joe. His feet and hands were tied, and there was a rag in his mouth, and he was crying, and man, I couldn't blame him. We were all scared. While Keith stayed in the doorway keeping an eye out for the men, I untied Joe and we heard the voices again. This time they were outside, and when we looked through the dirty windows, we could see the men in the backyard looking at the trees, and I'm sure they were looking for us. We decided that we'd try to open a front window and go out that way and avoid the men, and that's exactly what we did. There was a short drop into some bushes, and we got cut up pretty good, but we started running from home like you wouldn't believe. Halfway there, we slowed down and asked Joe what had happened, and he said when he came down from the upstairs, one of the guys grabbed him and they tied him up and put him in the closet. They didn't say a thing, and he had no idea what they were planning. When we got back to Keith's house, he had told his mom and dad what had happened, and his dad was on the phone with the police. They went out to the house, but there was no sign of the men other than a bunch of empty cans of food and dirty clothes. The men were nowhere to be found. We all got in trouble for going out there, and I sure got hided by my dad that night. But we all survived and now have a scary story to tell. The house was finally knocked down, the development went up, and we never saw those men again. Strange Creatures at a Canadian Resort by Bluegrass M. A bit of backstory before I start this. I live in northern British Columbia, Canada, and a couple of years back, my friend had invited me to come with him, his mom, and his sister to a resort by a lake about an hour and a half or so out of town. This was at the end of June and the beginning of July. I put resort in quotations because it's a main log building where you check in and out, and it also has a restaurant. There's a few log cabins and some spots down by the lake for RVs and stuff to park in. There's a highway that you turn off of to let you onto the lot where the check-in building is, and to the right of the highway is forest for miles as well as everywhere else around that area. The only thing that stands out is the highway, which cuts through the woods. Around the lake there's some houses and whatnot, but generally speaking, if it's not a long weekend, there aren't too many people out there. The cabins and RV area is separate, and the main building is about a 5 or 8 minute walk away from the cabins up a spiral road. A little past the main building, there's a clearing where you can sit at a couple of tables that look like they haven't been sat in for 10 years, as there's vines and grass that have grown around and on them. About 50 feet into the woods past those tables are 2 small lagoons surrounded by an old wire fence. I'll talk about why the lagoons and the table are important later. We got there in the early evening, unloaded the car, and got acquainted with the log cabin, which is really nice, by the way. And then we went out to explore around. Not too much interesting stuff happened on that first day, as we didn't explore a whole lot before dark. Skip to the next day, and it was cloudy and rainy, which we actually were hoping for, as that meant that there were very few people at the resort, and we'd get free reign over it. We explored down by the lake and around the cabin areas more thoroughly, and eventually made our way up to the clearing where the tables were. We looked at the tables and saw why they hadn't been touched in what looked like a long time from the amount of grass and weeds that I mentioned. And while investigating, I took some notice that around 50 feet or so back in the woods, there was what looked to be a clear area. We slid down into this ditch-like area, which was probably around an 8-foot difference in elevation from the table area, and we started tramping through the brush. We eventually came to the spot, which we were pretty sure are lagoons due to the way they're constructed, and noticed there was a wire fence around it. We walked around the area planning to leave, until we saw what looked like a spot where a large animal had walked over the fence and crushed a portion of it. Not really paying attention to the fact that a large animal may have been in the area, we dismissed those thoughts and said it was probably bent like this for a long time. We tooled around the area looking at the lagoons, and eventually we left as it was getting time to eat dinner. We planned to come back the next day with some big rocks to throw in. The next day we came back to the tables planning to go to that area, but before we had a chance to go down the ditch, we stopped because of a noise. This is what triggered the rest of the events in this story. The noises we heard were those of something walking over small twigs, snapping them in the lagoon ditch area where we had just traveled. Keep in mind, there weren't footsteps there the day before. We stuck around for about 10 minutes or so until we got hit with an intense feeling of dread. We said screw this and went back to our cabin where we played poker for the rest of the evening. While playing, we discussed the events that had taken place and eventually laughed it off, just saying it was probably a bear passing through or maybe some rabbits. The next day, it was raining heavily and much darker than the past couple of days. We left the cabin and planned to go to the lagoon area later, but we wanted to chill around a medium forested area close to the cabins that I forgot to mention in the beginning of the story. As I previously said, after we had originally gone to the lagoon area, things started getting weird. Now we were messing around in these other woods, breaking big sticks on trees, when we heard what sounded to be someone else doing the same thing, about 200 feet away, the direction we were facing. It was hard to judge how far exactly it was because of the way the forest carries sound, but it was pretty far in front of us. We didn't care too much about this until we took notice of where it actually was. The entire area around there and beyond is all forested, and having someone in those forests along with us that far in less than favorable weather, and again with very few people at the resort at that time, was unlikely. We decided to leave the area and come back later during the evening. Spoiler alert, that was not a good idea. So after leaving the area, we went around to the lagoon and listened for a couple of minutes. We couldn't hear any walking, so we assumed that we were right about it being a passing forest creature. Not even 10 steps in, I told my friend to stop moving. We both stopped and listened. We heard what sounded to be the steps again, but they were coming in louder and faster. We got the same overbearing feeling of dread. We hightailed it out of there, spooked as hell, and we booked it back to our cabin. Later that evening, we returned to the forest clearing earlier where we had heard the branch breaking against a tree noise earlier in the day. We again started smacking branches against the trees, this time not hearing anything. But as I turned to my left, something caught my eye. There was what appeared to be a person standing behind a tree, and I saw them duck behind it when they noticed I had noticed them. I nearly shit myself as I yelled to my friend that we needed to get out of here, and we sprinted back to the cabin. We returned the next day and I took a picture of where the figure was standing. Later that night, while we were sitting in the loft area where our beds were, we had a discussion about what happened that day. It was much less joking this time, and we were trying to make sense of it all. We started with the branch hitting the tree noise, and at first we tried to dismiss it by saying that it was an echo, but remembered that the echoes weren't prominent at the time, especially 5 seconds after hitting the tree. And only I was the one who saw the figure in the same area later. But I knew it was a person, or at least I think it was a person. We weren't too sure about that, so we moved on to talking about the lagoon and table area. Nothing really too interesting came up in that conversation. We left the next day as our booking had ended, and this is not the end of the story. We came back last year around the same time, end of June, beginning of July, but we had brought another friend with us this time. We showed him around and briefed him about what had happened the previous year, and he took it with a grain of salt, as any sane person would do. This eventually changed over the next 3 days. The activity this time around wasn't as much in the side forest where I saw the figure and where me and my friend had heard the tree noises, although we did hear the returning knocks again. But these sounds and things happened in the lagoon table area. After showing our friend the lagoon, we decided to enter it after not hearing any noises. All went well, and we returned the next day. This time, the footsteps were there once again, but a bit closer than before. We left that area but returned about an hour later, and we were determined to see what was repelling us out of there. But to get in, we figured we had to be quieter. Slowly, we went down the ditch and to the lagoons without anything hearing us. We didn't see anything there. We heard something snap a little bit away, so without making too much noise, we got out of there. The next and final day before we had to leave once again, we went back to that area, but when we were at the table, we heard something new. It was a sort of screeching noise, but it sounded like a person almost. At first, we did think it was a person who had injured themselves and was calling for help, but I made everyone stop and just listen before we did anything. We listened to it, and from what I heard, it sounded like a mixture between a person yelling and an angry cat hissing and a shallow dog barking all at once. My friends decided that they wanted to get closer and investigate the sound, and I was opposed to it. We went anyway, but I stayed much further away as my gut was telling me to get out of there. We threw rocks from the area where the sound was coming from, hoping to flush it out of its hiding spot. And when that didn't work, we got much too close. We were right at the edge of the ditch, and when I got as close as my friends did, the thing that was making the sound had either thrown a large log or had knocked down a tree, judging by the sound, but I didn't exactly stick around to investigate. I turned tail and bolted as fast as my legs would carry me. I was probably 15 yards ahead of my friends as my danger reflexes were faster coming to me, and it registered to me that I needed to get the hell out of there quicker than it did to them. We were about 100 feet away when we came to a stop. Nothing came after us, but the sounds resumed. We walked around the main building, and when we came around, there was a black bear standing there. We let out a sigh of relief as we thought we had been spooked by a bear, but then shifted back to our previous feeling of dread when the bear did the same as us. We got out of there, and he did too, both as fast as we could. We didn't investigate any further and ran back to our cabin. Nothing further happened as we left the following day due to the reservation being over again. I might be going back this year as it's approaching the same time, and that's why I'm writing this. I wanted to get out what I have so far, and if I go again this year, I'll update everyone about my experiences. I don't know what the lagoon table creature is, but I sure as hell know it isn't any bear. The other thing in the forest I'm still not sure about. I think that they're separate things, as the woodsman or tree knocker, as we've nicknamed it, is more elusive and seems to be luring us into that area, while the screecher is very territorial and aggressive. I've tried to find things online about a similar experience in that area, but I've come up empty, which is another reason why I'm posting this. Does anybody have any ideas about what these things are or could be? I have no clue what's going on there. Abandoned World War II fort. There's an abandoned and boarded-up World War II fort in the southern part of Belgium that we used to often sneak into with the scouts. Getting in there requires scaling a sheer wall. We placed anchoring points for ropes and climbing gear, and it was next to a relatively busy road. So you're being super quiet, making no light and cowering every time a car passes so they don't spot you in their lights. Now the atmosphere is set. The moment you enter it, it's like diving into water. Sound stops and the entire place is at a constant 14 degrees Celsius, with a slight breeze passing through. The tunnel is barely large enough for me, and I'm slightly broader than the average person, and it's hard to pass without turning your body sideways. The tunnel is just high enough to work up a decent gait while hunched over. If someone ahead of you blocks a passage for a moment, the breeze stops, and it feels like the entire tunnel network takes a breath. Because of the way the tunnels are constructed, they echo in a way that your own footsteps seem to be coming from behind you. They also seem to take one more step than you do when you stop. Of course, we don't allow the guys and gals to make any source of light in there, so it's pretty scary overall. One time I was in there, posted at a side passage to ensure everyone took the same path and didn't get lost. I went in first before any of the other climbers arrived, so they didn't know there were friendly faces in there to help them. I was in there for quite a while, just waiting for the first to come by, when I saw a dancing light coming down the long hallway. I quietly settled back in my nook and waited for whoever was smart enough to hide some matches from me, and then I would take them away. The light quietly bobbed closer when I realized there weren't any footsteps accompanying that light. I poked my head around the corner just in time to see it disappear, and still I heard no footsteps. I settled back and waited some more when I realized I did hear some scuffling. Very faint. Breathing noises, but still very faint. I become aware of a wet heat coming from right in front of me with a faint smell of sweat, dirt. Suddenly I realized there was someone there, right in front of me, inches from my face in the dark. The breathing stopped suddenly. Whatever it was aware of me as well. Whatever or whoever it was, we were both holding our breath, both acutely aware of one another. It took ages. I was sitting there, unable to move, speak, or breathe properly. And then the wet heat feeling passed, and some minutes later I became aware of a very faint light coming up from my right side, which soon dissipated and left. Some time later still, I heard the familiar stomping of combat boots coming down the hallway from my left. It was another person. I stopped them, told them to keep following the passageway and take the first right that they come to. Out of curiosity, I asked who was the first one in. He said no one. He was the first. It was explained much later. The first guy got lost down a dead-end side passage, and the second girl passed him by. She got nervous from the footsteps and removed her shoes. She saw me poke my head from around the corner and dropped her match, and then passed me very slowly. One of the checkpoints later said she was crying her eyes out. She had no idea it was there, and was more afraid of me than me of her. The Men Outside, submitted by Annie. When I was growing up in the 50s in a little town called Hopkinton, Rhode Island, we had one scare that affected me and my friend Susie. We were best of friends, but in this little town she lived a ways away from me, so when we were little we only saw each other at school and on weekends. There wasn't really much to our town, and I lived near a church that I think was later turned into a town hall, or it's now some preservation group. I haven't been back there since the late 60s, and I don't know anyone there at all. When Susie and I did get together, we had a lot of fun playing in the woods and in the creek that ran through town. I haven't thought about this in a long time, but my daughter told me that she listens to your show, and after listening to it, I remembered a scary time back around 1960. Susie and I must have been 9 or 10 when this happened. She was staying with my family one weekend in the summer, and we had been splashing around in the creek looking for salamanders and such. After a while, Susie nudged me and then pointed over to a tent or something on the other side of the water up a little bit. She said we should go over and check it out, and that's what we did. When we got closer to it, we could smell something bad. It's been so many years, but I remember like it was rotting meat or that sort of thing, just stinky, like body odor and sweat. We crept up to the tent wondering where it had come from and who it belonged to, as this didn't seem like anyone we knew from our tiny, tiny town. Older boys camped out all the time doing their Boy Scout things, but we knew most of them, even the older ones. Susie was always braver than me, and she picked up a stick and stuck it into the door flap of the tent and pushed it up a little bit. We saw a boot and jumped back a bit. There was someone in there. That's when we heard a voice behind us say, "You little girls, get away from there!" We nearly fell over scared out of our minds and turned to see a really scruffy-looking man standing near the woods a little ways away from us. He looked scary then, and he's still scary in my mind. He had a stained white shirt and looked like he hadn't shaved for weeks, but wasn't growing a beard. It was just gross looking. We both let out a little squeak like frightened girls do, and the man started walking towards us, saying, "Come here." I didn't want to, but we had also been raised to listen to our elders, so we just stood there being scared as he walked towards us. Just then I felt something on my foot, and I looked down and screamed as I saw a hand grabbing at my foot. Another man had come out of the tent, so there was another one in there. I jumped up, and my little shoe and sock came off in his hand, and I don't even remember looking at him as I started running away, telling Susie to come on. We slid down the bank into the creek and splashed ourselves away from the men. I looked back for 1 second and tripped, just like in the spooky movies. I looked up to see the men going down the bank and coming into the creek after us. I got up soaked, looking like a wet cat, and kept running with Susie, who was now way ahead of me. We ran and ran up out of the creek and into the woods that would lead us up to the church that I mentioned. My ankle was hurting me a lot, but we kept going, every once in a while hearing the men yell for us to get back there. Susie and I got to the road and to the church, but the front doors were locked, so we ran around the side. That door was locked too. "Should we just go to your house?" Susie asked, but I told her my ankle was hurt and I needed to sit down. She spied a window to the basement that was open and said we could hide there until we thought the men went away. We slipped in and dropped down to the dirt floor, and then we crawled to the other side of the basement, away from the windows and into the dark. It was dark and cold and wet down there, and it smelled funny like dirt basements do. There were 3 sets of windows on each side of the basement, and it didn't take long before we saw legs and feet moving slowly along them. We held our breath as the 2 men stopped at the open window. And they stood there for a while talking, but we couldn't hear them. And then they finally went away, thank goodness. We waited there in the dark for another half hour before we went over to a staircase that led up, hoping the door would be open. And it did. We stepped into a cleaning closet and then out into the church. A priest named Father James was out there, and he saw us and came walking over. I was still crying. My ankle hurt so much, and we tried to tell him what had happened, but I'm sure we were talking too fast, and we were still too scared to get things out. He said he'd walk us home, and that we were now safe. When we got there, my mother got upset, and we told her what had happened, and she called the doctor for me and tried to get us to stop crying and calm down. She thanked Father James, and he left. The doctor came out and looked me over and said it was just a mild sprain and that I needed to stay off it. I'll always remember that he said I needed to play indoor games for a bit, and my mother saying she'd already made that decision for me. Daddy got home from work later, and my mother told him what had happened, and he got on her phone and told the person on the line that he needed to make an important call, and whoever it was got off right away. It's funny how I remember things like this. Does anybody listening to this remember party lines? Wow, I guess I am really old. Later that night, some of the men in our town came over and sat on the porch talking to my daddy, but my mother shooed Susie and I back inside. We sat in the living room playing with some puzzles and listened to the radio, when Susie got up to go to my room to get something out of her weekend bag. A minute or so later, she screamed, and Mother and Daddy came running in, looking at me, and I just said, "Susie, she went into my room." They went to my room in the back of the house, and Susie was crying and saying that the man was in the window when she went in there. Daddy pushed her over towards my mother, who held her with open arms, and then he ran back to the porch. All I heard was, "That son of a bitch is out here," and the sound of the men getting up and jumping off the porch. Daddy ran back in, got his shotgun with my mother saying, "Dan, wait!" but he was already back outside. The men were gone for a long time that evening, and Susie and I were in bed when they got back. I heard Daddy come in, start whispering to my mother about something, and they whispered back and forth for quite a little bit. And then I fell asleep. The next day, I begged my mother to let me go outside in the backyard and just sit in the sun rather than be inside, and she said okay if I promised not to be up on my ankle. I sat in a lawn chair, and Susie was making me laugh with a dance and song she had just made up to entertain me. Then she stopped and pointed to a box by the side of my house and asked, "What is that?" I said it was Daddy's burning box. We burned a lot of trash in a fire once a week in the warmer months. She went over to it and picked up a dirty shirt that had what I thought was red paint on it at the time, but later figured out what it really was. Susie then picked up something else, just a bit because it was heavy. It was the tent where we had run into the men the day before. I can't say for certain what happened that night, but I have a pretty good idea. I'm not saying that it's right, but I do know that we were protected by my daddy and my friends' daddies. We never said a word to my daddy or mother that we saw those things in the burning box, and we promised each other we'd never tell. Susie lives in California now and I don't see her that much, but I think she'd be okay with me telling you this story. That was a very scary time in my life, and I'm still scared telling it right now. I let the black-eyed children in. Let me start by saying that I know how hard this all will be to believe. But now that things have taken a turn for the worse, I started looking for stories similar to mine. I feel like I should share this story with someone, and this seems like the right place. I made the mistake of letting the black-eyed kids inside, and now I'm worried that I might die because of it. I hope this will serve as a warning to anyone who is ever in this position to not make the same mistake I did. I live just outside of a rural town in Vermont. It's a tight-knit community where everyone knows one another and people don't lock their doors at night. There's never been any need to. A little over a year ago, I woke up because I heard a loud banging on my front door. At the time, my husband and I lived in a small home on a dirt road just off the rural route into town. It was the middle of a snowstorm, and the nearby hills get very slippery in the snow, so I thought that someone might have been in an accident and maybe broke down. It's happened before. When I looked out the window, I could see that our motion light was on. I could see that there were footprints in the snow that had come from our road and into our driveway, but there wasn't a car anywhere. The snow was still covering the road, and no one had driven on it for at least a couple of hours. Our front door was obscured from the window, but I could see that someone was standing there. I wasn't sure what to think, so I woke my husband up just to feel safer. While I was telling him what was going on, the banging on the door started again, and my husband went to answer it while I stood in the hallway. When he opened the door, there were two children standing in the snow, looking toward the ground. They were a boy and a girl, and could not have been more than 8 years old. They were dressed strangely and had odd haircuts. The girl's hair was very long and straight, and the boy had a dated haircut that looked almost like a bowl cut. They weren't dressed for winter, and my first thought was that they must have been Mennonite children. But as far as I know, there was never a large community of Mennonites near us. Thinking back on it, I know that my normal reaction to seeing children in a snowstorm would have been to rush them inside and bundle them up with some blankets and get them some hot cocoa. But that's not how I felt. The children were very unnerving. They would not make eye contact, and when my husband asked them if everything was okay, they asked if they could come in. My husband looked at me like, "What do I do?" And I asked the kids where their parents were. "They'll be here soon," is all they said. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning at this point, so the only reasonable thought in my head was that there must have been an accident or these kids got lost. As much as my instincts told me to not bring them inside, I did it anyway. I went into the kitchen to make them some hot cocoa while my husband took them into the living room. While I was fixing the kettle, I could hear my husband talking to the kids. He was asking them if they were okay, where they came from, how far they walked, if their parents' car was broken down, things like that. But they only answered with, "Our parents will be here soon." They spoke in a sing-songy voice, and they weren't afraid to be in a stranger's home at all. I started to notice that our cats, we had 4, were all hiding except Pigeon, who was in the kitchen with me. Normally, our cats are very curious and friendly, and we have to be careful that they don't run out of the door when we leave. This time, none of them even tried to see who was here, which I thought was very strange. All of the hair on Pigeon's neck was standing up, and his tail was puffed up while he stood looking into the living room. When I bent down to pet him and see what was wrong, he hissed and started growling and backed up until he had hid himself under the kitchen island. I had never seen him do that before. When I walked back into the living room, the kids were sitting on the couch as still as can be, but my husband was holding his head in his hands. And I asked him what was wrong, but he just said he felt really dizzy all of a sudden. He was fine. I turned back to the children to give them their cocoa, but when they looked at me, I gasped. It took everything inside of me to not drop the mugs and run away. When they looked at me, their eyes were completely black. They had no whites, just giant black pupils. When they saw that I was scared, they stood up and asked if they could use the bathroom. I tried to be as composed as I could be and showed them down the hall. They went into the bathroom together, and I hurried back to my husband to ask him if he had seen their eyes. He had seen them too, and said that it looked like his brother's badly bruised eyes after a car accident. We were in the middle of talking about whose children they could be, when my husband's nose started to bleed. He'd never had nosebleeds as long as I had known him, and I knew just from inside that this had something to do with the kids in the bathroom, and I started crying while I ran to get my husband some tissues. That's when the power went out. I heard my husband yell my name from the living room, and as I started to walk back through the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The two children were standing at the end of the hallway. They weren't moving, and I have never been so scared in my entire life. They just stood there in the dark. After what felt like forever, the boy said, "Our parents are here," and they walked to the door, opened it, and walked out, leaving it wide open. My husband jumped up to go close it and almost fell over. We looked out the window and saw two men standing by a black car idling at the end of our driveway. The men looked like they were wearing black-colored suits and were very tall, at least 6 feet. When my husband waved at them, they just stared at us, got into their car, and drove off. Our power came on about a half an hour later, but nothing was the same after this. Over the next few months, 3 of our cats went missing. We can only assume that they ran away somewhere and never came back, but the worst thing was coming home to find Pigeon in a puddle of blood on the living room floor. He looked like he'd been vomiting blood, and the vet told us that he had some kind of hemorrhage. After my husband's nosebleeds became a regular occurrence, we went to see the doctor. He didn't know what to make of it other than dry nasal passages, but my husband was diagnosed with an aggressive skin cancer. When the doctor asked us if we used tanning beds, we both thought he was joking, but apparently this kind of melanoma is linked to overuse of indoor tanning. The doctors think he will recover, but don't understand how he got it so bad so quickly. My husband has never worked an outdoor job and spends relatively little time in the sun. Since we let the black-eyed kids inside our home, I've also suffered from regular dizzy spells and nosebleeds on a regular basis. I've had other issues which I won't mention here, but trust me when I say that I'm suddenly in the worst condition of my life, and no one seems to be able to do anything about it. I know that all of this is because I let those kids into my home. We've told everyone we could about the strange kids that showed up that night, but no one else saw them, and some laugh at how scared we were of Mennonite kids. But we know what we saw. I wish my husband had never opened the door. Let this serve as a warning to others about the black-eyed children. My advice would be lock your doors, call the police, and wait for morning. Don't make the same mistake I did. A New House Haunting, submitted by Daniel R. I'll start off with telling you that we had to move from our old house due to complications with the landowner. We moved to the other side of town, about 15 minutes away, but the story starts with me seeing what people call shadow men, or shadow beings. This was in our old house about 5 years ago when I was 13. One night, when I was falling asleep in my room, I suddenly felt paralyzed with fear, as if something bad was coming. Sure enough, it appeared. I had not yet closed my eyes and was staring into the dark room with only a faint nightlight going on in the hallway. When all of a sudden, in the middle of my room, this thing just appeared. Starting from a small ball, which was most likely an orb, it turned into full human size in a span of about 2 seconds. This thing was so dark that, in the already dark room, I could see it ever so clearly. This was not your normal fucking shadow being, just like a slender dark shadow. It was tall, and what's so damn creepy about it was that I could clearly see a set of horns on its head, and what seemed to be cowboy boots with the little sharp spinning balls at the heel. Yeah, pretty damn strange. The most horrifying thing about it was that I could distinctly see two tiny faint reddish dots where the eyes should be. As cliche as it sounds, it was there. It appeared in the far end of my room and started walking around, and most people would shut their eyes, but I was so fucking terrified I couldn't take my eyes off of it. So, in case it would try to kill me, I would run away. And so was my little 13-year-old brother Brian's plan at the time. The being started walking around the room as if not seeing me. It went over to my desk and then to my door, and then it suddenly turned around, sharply in my direction, as if it had just learned of my existence. And to my horror, it walked towards me. My blood ran colder than the cruel temperatures of space, and as it made its way to me, I was thinking, well, this is how I'm gonna frickin' die. I wanted to close my eyes, but I couldn't. The thing came up to my bed, got on all fours and looked under my bed, and then stood up and returned to the corner where it originally came from. And it disappeared the same way it had appeared. What the hell? Was it just fucking messing with me, I thought? I took my chances and bolted to my brother's room and spent the night there. Nothing ever happened in that house again, so I moved on. It could not have been a dream because I had not fallen asleep yet, and the whole thing was just so real and vivid. Moving on in my life, as I said earlier, we had to move out of that house. We found a house that had 4 rooms and 5 bathrooms, with one room that was on the 2nd story. That house was just perfect for our family of 7. One time, after we just got the keys to the house and hadn't even moved in yet, I was left in the house with my little sister who was 8 years old, just to chill while my mom and brother went to the store. Tell you what, when I was in the house to check it out with my family, the house had no bad or creepy vibes to it. But when I was left there alone with my sister, everything changed. I don't know how to explain it, but me and my sister just felt this bad vibe and felt unknown fear, the kind of fear that makes your hair stand on end. Yeah, I was 18 at the time, and hell, I was ready to nope the fuck out. But I tried to stand my ground and show my sister that there was nothing to be afraid of. This was in broad daylight around 3 p.m., but something was just really, really off, and my sister would not leave my side. We were just walking around the house and exploring, learning the light switches and whatnot. My sister kept making comments about how scared she was and how she wanted to go outside, and although I was quite shaken up myself, I wanted to explore on. As we were walking around, I heard the doorbell go off, and let me tell this right now, around the whole property there is a 7-foot-tall metal fence with spikes on the top, and the only entrance to the place was through a sliding gate to the driveway and a door with a deadbolt for a lock. The gate also had one of those Brinks locks on it, and after the doorbell went off I thought, oh, my brother and mom must be back even though they'd only been gone for about 10 minutes. I thought they'd be gone much longer. I made my way to the door and opened it, and there was no one there. My first thought was that it was the neighborhood kids playing a game of ding-dong ditch on the newcomers. So I went over to the front gate, and both of the ways in were locked. I thought, how the hell did they make it in here? I went around the front and back yards, and no one was there. All the while my sister was with me, because again, she refused to stay in the house by herself. So I went back in with her, and as soon as I closed the door, the fucking doorbell rang again. I knew this was not normal. The doorbell was right at the door, and it just rang again as soon as I closed the door. Not to freak my little sister out, and myself for that matter, I brushed it off, saying that the thing was broken and we probably need to get it fixed. So we went on exploring the house, and at some point we kind of split up with each other in different rooms. Then I heard my sister shriek in fear, and she came running out to me. When I asked her what happened, she just kept stuttering, There's a guy in the back room. There's a guy. He's black and he's in the back room." She pointed to the room that was to be my room. And then she said, he just jumped behind the corner." I thought it was that trick your eyes play on you and you think you see things jump behind corners. So we went to check it out, and there was nothing there, obviously. As I showed her the empty room and tried to convince her that it was her eyes playing tricks on her, I turned my head to my older sister's room to be and saw what she was talking about. That shadow lurker didn't jump behind the corner right away. The shadow thing stood there for about a second before jumping out of sight. What in the hell? I thought. This house is certainly going to be interesting. Moving on, some 3 weeks later, everything was quiet. We'd moved in and settled down, and all was good. Then that shit started up all over again. My little sister, who took the top stairs room, remind me to remind you that there's only one room up there again, one time she came running down at night to my parents' room. The next morning, my parents told her that she must have had a bad dream, that something was scratching on her walls and walking around the room. I knew this had to be something more, but I didn't say anything about it. Another week went by, and 2 more times my sister came running down at night before she completely refused to sleep in her room. My parents kept reassuring her that it was her dreams and just the fear of a new house that was getting to her. She wouldn't have it. My dad ended up sleeping a few nights up there and said it was strange because when he did sleep there, he would have negative dreams, like someone was dying or something. So comes around the night, and it's time for my sister to go to bed, and she tried to sleep in my parents' room, but my mom asked me to take her up there and settle her down. I ended up having to pick up my little sister over my shoulders and carry her up there. And as I started making it up the stairs, she began to cry, telling me that she did not want to sleep there. I completely understood, and took this opportunity to talk to her about everything she had been experiencing. I sat down with her and calmed her down, and then began to talk with her. I asked her to tell me why she had run down 3 times at night, and she told me the first night what had happened was that she heard scratches on the wall across from her, and then a black figure that darted across the room from her window to the door. She saw it because the room was lit up with a nightlight, and she said it was man-sized. The second time she ran downstairs was because she woke up with sleep paralysis and felt utter dread. She slowly opened her eyes, and there it was, in her room, just staring at her. This went on for a little while until she finally got the strength to say, "Go away," and it did. And then she ran to my parents' room. Then the third time is when it got to be its worst. She hadn't fallen asleep just yet when she heard the scratching again. She tried to ignore it, but it got louder, and she felt paralyzed again. She said she was laying on her back with her eyes closed, and then felt 2 hands come in contact with her on either side of her chest, and started to push down slowly. She opened her eyes, and there was no one there. The pushing got harder and harder until she could almost not breathe, before it just sort of jumped off of her. She ran down crying that time, and hated that my parents kept telling her that it was dreams. I couldn't fucking believe it. If this shit of a ghost was going after my family to hurt them, I wasn't going to have any of that. I decided to do an experiment with her to check if it was after my sister or if it was the upstairs room. We switched rooms for the night, and I'll tell you right now that it's the frickin' room. What happened to me that night I will never forget. Around 3 a.m., again, I woke up to sleep paralysis too. I knew what was up, so I battled the fear and won. I sat up, looked around, and saw nothing. But I still felt the fear and the feeling of being watched. I decided to ignore it and just laid back down to sleep, and I swear upon my whole life that what happened next is the truth. About 2 minutes after laying down on my stomach, I felt 3 solid yet somehow gentle taps on my shoulder. I picked up my head and said, "What the hell?" And right into my ear, I heard a whispering voice say, "Hello there." I fucking lost it. I sprang out of my sister's bed and turned on the lights and screamed, "Hell no! Your ass gotta get the fuck out of this house and never return." Then behind me, I swear I thought I heard a girl's voice giggle, gently. No one sleeps in that room anymore. I convinced my parents that strange shit is going on in there, and they agreed to move my little sister into my older sister's room. Nothing ever happens around the other parts of the house. but from time to time when I'm home alone, I hear that same giggle coming from that room. Always Lock Your Doors by Groundbreaking. It all started and ended the day after I took my last final. I don't know if this guy was a stalker or if it was a break-in gone weird. From the beginning, I was nervous that I was going to fail this one class and wasn't going to be able to receive my associate's degree. Later in the day after I took the exam, I was out at the pool at my apartment complex with some friends and my roommates. I checked my phone and I saw I passed my class. I got so excited, I told everyone we were going to celebrate because I was the last one to have a final. It was 3 days before I got to walk and graduate with this degree, and I decided we should have some fun before we all went our separate ways. As things got later into the night, we decided not to go out and just to stay in, so we invited a couple more people over and we went on with the night. Around 2 in the morning, people started to leave and head to bed, and the only people left were my 2 roommates, the people they were dating, and one other friend. We were still messing around, and because our apartment was on the first floor and next to the pool, we went out to do some night swimming. As soon as we were done, I was ready to just hang out and be in for the night, but my roommates and my other friend all left to go somewhere else, which was fine. It was nothing out of the ordinary for me to be home alone. I just got some food and went to my room to hang out until they got back. Now, the way my room was set up in our apartment is that it was all the way in the back, farthest away from the front door and the patio door. My room is behind the kitchen, and you really have to go through the entire apartment to get there. Because our apartment was in the front of the complex and near the pool, it was near the front gate, and at the time the gate was left open because, well, it was broken. I've never had an issue with living this close up front, until this night. My room has one big window, and you can easily see in if you don't have the blinds or curtains shut. I had a closet with mirror doors, which, if you were to look in through the window, you could see every part of my room. So while I was waiting for my friends to get back, I fell asleep. The last time I looked at a clock, it was around 3:30 in the morning. The key part in the story is that my bedroom light was on when I went to sleep. When I woke up, it was around 5:30, and there were flashes going off. It was like I had a strobe light going off in the corner of my room. I woke up really confused and thought it was my friends coming back to mess with me. Once my eyes got adjusted because the light was now out and the room was dark, I realized that in fact it was not my friends messing with me, but a single man who was at least 6 feet tall. He was wearing a green Nike hoodie, and he was standing in the corner of my room by my closet, holding a phone up, taking pictures of me. Mind you, I had tiny Sophie shorts on with one of my legs hanging out of my covers, and I don't think he realized I'd woken up, and when reality sank in, I said, "Hey, what the fuck?" Instead of coming at me or running out of my room, the man put the phone down and walked out of my room casually, not saying anything, not in a panic. He just walked out. Me, being the dumbass that I am, ran after him, yelling, "Hey!" I tried to follow him out, but once I got to the front door, I didn't see him anywhere. I ran back inside, woke up all my roommates asking if they were messing with me, and when they said no, I called the police. I looked around my room, and the only thing that was missing was my laptop that was on my desk. The weirdest part about that was that my laptop was in the farthest part of my room, with my door closed, and outside in the kitchen on the counter, there were 3 MacBook laptops, 2 wallets, and at least a $300 speaker. But the only thing missing from the entire apartment was my laptop. Later on, I found out that the front door and the patio door were never locked when everyone came back from where they were, and, unfortunately, the police couldn't find the guy or my computer. What made things worse was that the SIM disk from my camera was in the computer, so all my personal photos from that camera were now accessible to this guy. A couple days later, while I was getting ready to move out, I saw some things that freaked me out even more. As I mentioned earlier, if you looked into my window, you could see my closet mirrors and see just about my entire room. One thing that was super noticeable was my tapestry. It was a distinct tapestry, and very different. It had two wolves howling up at a moon, and it was all black and white. So when I was packing up my car, I happened to look up, and it was starting to get dark, but I noticed the apartment above mine through the blinds on the wall was the exact same tapestry as the one that was in my room. What creeped me out even more was that I had little purple lights around mine that my mom had given me because she knows my favorite color is purple. In the room above mine, in the lights in the fan, the bulbs were switched out for purple ones. In the end, the guy was never found and I never saw his face, which freaks me out to this day. I hope I never come across him again. I never got my laptop back and never found my SIM disc to my camera. My best advice to anyone living in a college town is no matter what, always lock your doors, because you never know what you could wake up to. A Real Fixer-Upper by Pickle Juice in My Paper Cut. About 5 years ago, my husband Adam and I decided it was finally time to start looking to purchase a house. We'd always talked about buying an older fixer-upper home because we've had the idea that they hold more charm and character. Plus, we could appreciate a place that had its own quirks, and we loved the thought of turning something run down into something beautiful again. With that being said, I grew up in a pretty rural farming town in Indiana that had more than its fair share of run-down houses. The surrounding areas had started to boom a little bit, with farmland being sold off and turned into new factory locations, along with new subdivisions for the people coming to work for them. I thought it'd be a great place to start our own house hunt. I figured we'd be a lot closer to civilization than I was used to growing up, but not so much that we'd be living a stone's throw away from our neighbors. Adam and I decided to take a drive one summer Sunday afternoon so I could show him some of the back roads of my hometown and to also see what some of the properties we checked out online looked like in person. As we were turning off the main road through town and further onto a more secluded country road, we noticed that the very first house on the left was completely abandoned. We pulled into a small patch of the yard where the grass was the shortest and where a gravel driveway used to be. We were going to further investigate. It was painted a deep green color, which made it almost invisible against the tall grass, sticker bushes, and weeds that had grown up around it. There was a massive tree in the front yard whose branches and leaves helped to camouflage this place even further. The house looked as if it were at least 100 years old, and it looked like it had sat empty for years. It looked neglected, weather-worn, and in need of major love. In that moment, it was perfect. There was nothing but woods across the street and no neighboring houses in sight, so Adam and I thought it probably wouldn't hurt if we just trespassed a little. I completely justified my reasoning by thinking, well, we're interested in buying the property. We're not here to cause trouble. We're doing someone a favor. We could take this burden of a house off of someone's hands. We just need to take a look around first, that's all. And plus, there weren't any no trespassing signs anywhere, so I was perfectly armed with my newfound inflated ignorance and arrogance to assess this property. We walked carefully through the brush toward the left side of the house, where we noticed a well that was still standing, complete with bucket, rope, handle, and the original overhang. My excitement for a picturesque country house was building, and directly across from the well, there was a side entrance into the house through what looked like an add-on mudroom. The screen door to the mudroom was closed, however there was a wooden door behind it that was half open. This was our not really intrusive because we aren't breaking anything to get in, way in. It was probably the mid-90s out that day, so when we entered, Adam first, we were met with thick, stifling heat, the kind that holds so much humidity that it almost takes your breath away. What we thought was a mudroom was an extended pantry area or canning kitchen. It was tiny with only one window, an old rusted sink, a small stove, and the walls still held shelves upon shelves of canned and spoiled vegetables in jars. I remember thinking, yeah, this'll be great. I totally remember how to can. We can even have a garden and insert all kinds of other giddy thoughts women have while in the throes of house hunting. It also had the doorway into the main part of the house, and this is where my elation came to an end. Through the doorway was the kitchen. What remained of the cabinets and sink were against the wall on the left, but they were either broken or hanging on for dear life, or both. The kitchen connected to a wide open living area, with one side still having walls streaked with black that led up to a half-sunken gray ceiling. There had been a fire here at some point. The windows on that wall were filthy, covered in dust or ash that made the room much darker than it should have been in the middle of the day. My heart sank. I knew we wouldn't be able to afford a costly repair of a house fire, but I kept that disappointing thought to myself. The open living area had not one stitch of furniture, save for one small wooden rocking horse that a child would have. The floor was littered with magazines, as if someone had a giant stack of them and just threw them up in the air to see where they would land. Curious as to what the former homeowners liked in regards to reading material, I decided to check them out. Almost every single magazine was related to dolls in some way. Porcelain doll collecting, Barbie dolls, making dolls by hand, clothing for dolls. I felt a little creeped out by it, especially under the surveillance of the rocking horse's dead, painted-on stare. But I figured that an old lady must have lived in the house before, and I created a self-medicating idea that her husband probably died, and this was her only hobby she had to pass her time. We decided to check out another room that was connected to the half-burned living area. Through the doorway to the left was a weird combination of a molded, stand-up shower with handicapped handles, an assisted toilet next to it, divided down the middle by a wall. On the right side was a wall made entirely of built-in bookshelves. The shelves were full of paperwork, manila envelopes, books, and even more magazines. It struck us as a pretty weird setup, but thought these people must have really loved to read while sitting on the toilet. My husband and I thought we could find out who the previous homeowners were, since some of the paperwork on top of the stack seemed to be old bills. If we wanted to look up property records, at least now we would have a name to go on. I grabbed a stack of papers and began to flip through them. When about halfway through, they changed from being old telephone bills to printed out colored pictures from the internet of porcelain dolls. I put the stack of papers back on the shelf and picked up a small red 5-star notebook. I started from the beginning, casually leafing through and seeing daily entries of medications taken, blood pressure and glucose measurements, and it was all written in a neat hand. About 20 pages in, the entries started to change entirely. They became crude drawings of twisted faces done in red ink. The faces had horns or bloody fangs, and then full-on drawings of devils appeared in the pages after. I wanted to believe that a child had picked up this to doodle in, but I felt like this was something much different than that. After the drawings, the notebook became someone's personal journal, written in what I assumed was an elderly man's cursive. It told how he knew he was coming toward the end of his life, and how he remembered just being a young boy when his mother passed away. He described in detail how the wake for his mother was held in the front room of his house, and how during those nights he crawled on top of his mother's body in her coffin to sleep. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Even though I had been sweating from the thickness in the air, a sudden rush of goosebumps came over me. I immediately showed the book to Adam, flipping to the pages of devils and snarled faces, and then read aloud this stranger's memories of his mother just to see if it was the same the second time around. After I finished, Adam said, "Well, this just got a whole lot weirder," nodding to what he was holding in his hands. While I was reading the notebook, he had continued rifling through the mountains of papers. One stack not only had more printed pictures of dolls, but now they contained pictures of real women in torture bondage. Ball gags or electrical tape placed over their mouths, jumper cables twisting their nipples, them being hogtied with rope. Sometimes there was more than one woman in the picture. It felt as if a brick had been tossed into my stomach. For some, those images wouldn't be disturbing, but in the context of our visit, my panic was starting to grow. I was torn between wanting to find out more and getting the fuck out. Adam reassured me that while it was on the creepy side, it wasn't anything to necessarily lose my shit over, since the women didn't seem to be suffering or bleeding. The burned-out living area was separated from the rest of the house by a staircase. The staircase had a room directly across from it, and a small hallway on the other side that led to the main room at the front of the house. We debated on going up to the second floor, but decided against it since it already felt as if we were roasting in an oven, and we were unsure of the stability of the second story. Going into the room across the staircase, we noticed a few more doll magazines on the floor, but not near the number as the other room. There were scattered plastic doll pieces here and there, random arms and heads. To the left was the original fireplace with a couple of tiny vases on the mantel. Smack dab in the middle was a framed picture of an elderly couple, smiling and happy. These certainly weren't the type of people that would have pictures of women bound and gagged hidden away in their bathroom. These people could have been my grandparents, I thought to myself. To the right was a big bay window, and smack dab in the middle was a yellowed piece of paper with faded black printed handwriting on it. It was for anyone on the outside of the house to see before it became overgrown. Reading it backwards from inside, it said, "If you're here to talk about Jesus, go away." "That's kind of hilarious," Adam said, after reading it for himself. "Yeah, it kind of is," I half-chuckled. But something in my brain was now starting to nag me even more. Something wasn't computing correctly for me. Thinking back, my mind was putting together that an elderly couple in this town would more than likely be pretty religious, and by the super small chance that they weren't, it would have been gossiped about had someone seen that in the window. It was as if the house had held two very different personalities. I told my husband I just wanted to go into one last room down the little hallway, and then I would be very ready to leave. Going down the small hallway, it became darker and cooler. It was a relief from the oppressive heat that we had been dealing with since we first stepped inside. The shade from the giant tree in the front yard had blocked out a lot of the sunlight, making it about 20 degrees cooler. But we soon realized that wasn't the only reason this part of the house's temperature was more than tolerable. Rounding the corner into the last room, it took a few seconds for our eyes to adjust to the difference in light, but the change of the air was noticeable immediately. It was as if we had stepped into a cave. The smell was dank and left a dampness on our skin. Once things came clear into focus, that's when we saw it, the main reason our senses had shifted so quickly. A large hole in the floor. At first we thought perhaps the wooden floor was so weak that it had simply caved in on its own, or that the roof had leaked and caused this exact area of floor to rot away. But upon getting closer, it became obvious that wasn't the case. The hole was about 5 feet across and went straight down into the earth, with about a 2-foot space between the remaining floor and dirt. This hole was there because it was made to be there. My husband and I looked at each other. My heart was racing so fast that I thought it would burst through my chest, and I said aloud to him while pointing, "What the fuck is this? Why is this here?" I panicked, my breathing becoming more rapid and shallow. Nothing was making sense, and yet the thoughts that had been running in the background of my brain were all coming together like a jigsaw puzzle. And then we saw them. The worn and faded Social Security cards. A few old and molded over driver's licenses just thrown around haphazardly. Checkbooks, credit cards. As if someone had emptied their purse or wallet in this room and then just disappeared into the hole. I was overcome with terror and dread, and I had to get out of this house. My skin felt like static, as if my whole body had been taken over by the sensations of when your foot falls asleep. I had tears forming in my eyes, and my mind just told me to run. Without having to speak, Adam quickly took me by the arm and led us back down the hallway, through the burned-out living room and kitchen, out the side canning room and back into the light of day. We ran back down the mangled and tangled driveway to the car, and remembering back, I get the eerie feeling that we weren't the only two people in the house that day, alive or dead. A side note, the house still stands. We never called the police to report us breaking into this house and finding the giant hole in the floor. However, we drove past it about a year later, and the large tree in the front yard had all its branches removed. All of the windows had been boarded shut, and after doing some research, found out the land it sits on is still for sale. but the house itself has been condemned. Cornfield Killer by Lucinqua90. I live in a small town in an Eastern European country. Actually, it's the fourth biggest town in our country with about 80,000 residents, but you feel like everyone knows you anyways. I always felt pretty safe here, so I wasn't afraid to take my bike and go for a ride alone. Just me, nature, and beautiful summer sunset. There's nothing more relaxing after a long day in school or work. About 3 weeks ago, a heat wave hit our region, and it was almost impossible to stay in town. So I planned myself a trip for Sunday, June 23rd, and this day will be important later. My plan was to ride to the nearest lake about 20 kilometers away and to stay outside the whole day. I packed my book, notepad, food and water, and left my flat early in the morning so I would be at the lake just before the biggest heat. I decided to take the concrete roads. And that's how we call the old roads outside of the town, which were formerly used as a shortcut from one village to another, so the drivers didn't have to go through town. The infrastructure is much better now, and the concrete roads are not used by drivers anymore. They became a perfect spot for biking, skating, and jogging. Many bikers who don't own helmets, including me, shame on me, I know, are using them to get to the nearest villages without being caught by police because riding outside the town without a helmet is forbidden here. As I mentioned before, it can be a pretty busy place in the daytime, but at that Sunday morning, I was there alone. It didn't bother me. As an introvert, I enjoy being alone. And despite the fact that it wasn't even 9 a.m., it was getting hotter and I was sweating already, so I decided to take a break and refresh myself. I stopped at a crossroads and pushed my bike to the sideway road between two fields of corn. I sat on the ground and drank. Suddenly, I heard a strange rustling from the field behind my back. I looked around but saw nothing. Maybe an animal or wind, I told myself, but a strange feeling of tension remained. As I was putting the bottle back to my backpack, I heard the same noise again, but this time it felt closer. Shivers went down my spine and all the hair on my neck stood up. I looked up on the side of the road in front of me. Nothing. Just corn waving calmly in the wind. It was so hot already, I decided not to waste time and to continue on my way to the lake. While trying to sit on my bike, I noticed a few corn were waving more roughly than others. I stood there with one foot on the pedal, waiting for what might come out of the field. I hoped for a rabbit or a fawn, but it was a person. A tall man in a long coat and dirty working overalls with long greasy hair and an unshaved beard. He looked scruffy and he wasn't wearing any shoes. Probably a homeless person, I thought. He walked slowly, but all of a sudden he stopped in the middle of the road. He turned his head and saw me standing there looking at him. I couldn't move. He leapt in my direction, but then he probably changed his mind and stopped. He smiled and waved at me, and then continued to walk in his previous direction towards the other field. As soon as the corn swallowed him up, I jumped on my bike and rode back home. My roommate had just woken up, so I told her everything. She said it was probably just a member of a group of hobos living next to the nearby river. I agreed, and soon I forgot the whole incident, until yesterday. I was scrolling through my Facebook newsfeed when I saw an article in a local newspaper's Facebook page. A body of a girl my age, 23, was found the day before, July 7th, 2018. She was found in bushes near the river. That girl went missing on the evening of Friday, June 22nd. She came home from work, went jogging, and never came back. In the article, there was a picture of her and also a picture of the place where the body was found. I realized it was just a few meters from the place where I met that weird man from the cornfields just one day before she went missing. I reported everything to the police immediately. They identified the man within 2 or 3 days and accused him of murder. Among other evidence against him, underwear of the victim was found in a pocket of his long coat. Cornfield killer? I'm sure we won't meet again. Rot in prison.